is Friday, July 20th, 1984, and the Reverend Sun Myung Moon is going to jail for the 6th time in his life. Respectfully bowing to one another in the traditional Korean manner, his family readies itself for his long absence and reaffirms its support of him. For government prosecutors, it is a day of victory, and perhaps for scores of Americans, their hearts will gladden with the news on their television sets. But for members of his church, it is a time of new determination. For those of us on the outside, he remains an enigma whose presence is as commanding as it is disturbing. Is he a true religious leader, or simply a charlatan whose gross deceptions have been exposed? Is his incarceration justice due, or another case of religious intolerance? Why did he come here in the first place? Who are his followers? What is his real motivation? These are the questions we sought to answer, and this is what we found. He was born January 6, 1920, in Jeongju, in the province of Pyeongbokdo, in what is today North Korea. The second son in a family of 8 children, his parents were simple farmers who were referred to by what is known in the Korean as those who could live without law, distinguishing them as people who could live by conscience alone. When he was 10 years old, his family converted to Christianity, and those who knew the young boy testified to his profound seriousness at that time. I had a very strong desire to live a life of high dimension, he told a group of followers in 1970. I started praying for extraordinary things. Korea at that time was under the iron fist of Japanese colonial rule, and the thrust of Japan's policy was the total annihilation of Korean culture. Use of the Japanese language was mandatory in public places. Christianity was forbidden, while participation in Japanese Shinto rituals was compulsory. On Easter Sunday morning, 1936, Reverend Moon tells us that while he was deep in prayer, the Spirit of Jesus appeared to him and told him that the mission for the accomplishment of God's will on earth was unfulfilled. Could he now be responsible for the accomplishment of that mission? Reverend Moon took the vision in earnest, but he knew that if the meaning of the vision were to be understood fully, he had much to learn and much to endure. He spent the next 9 years studying in Japan and praying over the many complex and unsolved mysteries of the Bible. Through this search, he received the fundamental principles which guide his life and form the core of his teachings. With the American defeat of Japan in 1945, Korea was liberated from 40 years of Japanese domination. Reverend Moon returned to Korea, where he married and began to preach. But by February of 1946, the communists were dominating North Korea under the leadership of a man chosen by the Russians, Kim Il-sung. Kim had been trained by the Chinese Red Army and accompanied it as it marched into North Korea. Refugees poured south trying to flee the chaos and bloodshed of the North. It was at this time, Reverend Moon tells us, that God told him to leave his family and go into North Korea to confront the growing acceptance of atheistic communism. Failing to understand such a commitment to his mission, his wife would divorce him years later. On July 1st, 1946, he arrived in Pyongyang, a city that at that time had so many churches, it was called the Jerusalem of the East. Reverend Won-pil Kim, the first man to follow the young teacher, recalls those days in Pyongyang.
Centering upon one family's home, Reverend Moon would give his message to the people. There he prayed and spoke his new understanding of truth. In his services, he would always start with tears and end with tears. That was the spirit he was always in. It was not uncommon for people to stay late into the night listening to teacher. Many Christians did not return to their churches after they heard Reverend Moon's sermons, and the churches would begin to face financial difficulty. The ministers then tried to stop their members from coming, usually by witnessing bad things about Reverend Moon. When that did not work, they wrote letters to the communist authorities complaining.
On August 11th, 1947, Reverend Moon was arrested by North Korean authorities. He was interrogated, beaten, and tortured until believed dead. His body was then thrown into a snowbank outside the prison walls. He was found by a few followers and nursed back to health with what one person described as a mixture of herbal medicine and prayer. He soon began to teach once again, attracting numerous members from churches throughout the city. By 1948, the communists were in full control of North Korea. Ministers again wrote letters to the communist authorities complaining about Reverend Moon, and on February 22, 1948, he was again arrested. Charged with advocating social chaos, he was sentenced to 5 years of hard labor at the notorious death camp in Hongnam. Within the camp, prisoners working in twos were required to fill 80-pound bags with sodium fertilizer, then load them onto railroad cars. The diet consisted of one small bowl of rice and seaweed soup per day. Mr. Chung Hwa Park, a fellow prisoner with Reverend Moon in Hongnam, recalls the experience.
Hongnam prison was such a terrible place to live. Everywhere, people were dying. One day, a young man helped me with my work. His name was Sun Myung Moon. I could never forget about him because there was such a small amount of food and he always gave half to others, and also his water. Even with such a small amount, he didn't drink everything. He would save a little bit so that he could wash his body in the morning before he prayed.
With the Russians supplying the arms and assistance necessary, North Korean troops poured across the 38th parallel into South Korea on June 25, 1950. 16 nations under the United Nations flag, led by General Douglas MacArthur, responded to the South cry of desperation. The beginning of the war was a rout, but a massive counteroffensive, launched to coincide with MacArthur's incredibly daring landing at Incheon on the western coast, allowed the UN forces to push the invaders back north of the 38th parallel by the middle of September. With United Nations forces nearing Hungnam, the prisoners were told to prepare for a systematic evacuation. In reality, they were being taken away and executed in mass graves. On the day Reverend Moon was to be executed, United Nations forces liberated Hungnam and its prisoners. Soon after, Sun Myung Moon, Chung Hwa Park, and Won Pil Kim began the arduous journey south. It was November 4th, 1950.
Because I had been a communist leader, they were now trying to kill me. They broke my legs. At that time, I had to determine my feelings whether or not to go with teacher. He brought a bicycle and put me on. In my mind, such a terrible situation.
Although the journey south took 10 days for most refugees, it took Reverend Moon's party almost 2 months. With major roads restricted to military use, the refugees fleeing south had to take remote routes, many of which crossed dangerous mountain passes.
Between Hakdu and Hwangju, there's a 130-meter mountain. It was so difficult to push the bicycle. It was impossible. So I told him, please, leave me here and go on with Won Pil Kim. Teacher told Won Pil to take the bicycle, and he told me to come on his back. Teacher told me there are so many things happening in the future. For you, for us, me, and Won Pil. Heaven will help us, so please, don't be weak-minded. That is how we crossed the mountain, with me on his back.
Attempting to reach an island off the coast near Haeju, where they had been told boats were taking refugees to Busan, the trio traversed the tidal range to the island only to discover that no boats remained. This recently discovered photograph by an unknown UN photographer remarkably captured Reverend Moon carrying Chung Hwa Park during their 2.5-mile trek back to the mainland.
At that time of war, people had to give up their parents, children, wife, everything. Yet Reverend Moon was trying to save me. He kept telling us about what the future world would be. I was really amazed, and I determined I had to follow him, even though I might die.
Reverend Moon commented to me that Mr. Park was a representative of all mankind, because from God's point of view, all mankind is, in a sense, crippled.
Using American forces ration boxes and scrap tin, Reverend Moon built his first church when they arrived in Busan in January of 1951. The number of refugees arriving in Busan and the scarcity of materials available made such a construction necessary for many refugees. It was here that he actually began writing down the insights which he had received years before and which were to later become known as the divine principle.
Well, I do think that this is an age of science and reason, and many of the concepts about the nature of God that have been explained metaphorically in the past are explained much more clearly through the principle. That is, the qualities of God, the attributes of God, the way in which God works historically. Now, what Reverend Moon has done in his both revelation and reason presented through the divine principle is offer us a contemporary view drawing upon a very ancient tradition, something by which we can understand the human condition in relationship to God.
He is the first one, probably ever, walked on the face of the earth, explained and introduced God of brokenhearted. Why he was brokenhearted? Because he intended to build kingdom on earth, loving children of God. But because of the fall of man, the man departed from him and everybody become sort of a prodigal son. And in a way, like a parent who loves their children. That's the heart of God. He described that God in such a way that he wept himself for that God, and made millions of people around the world wept for that God. And that is probably one of the deepest things I grasped, I felt and I learned from Reverend Moon. Reverend Moon is one man who knows the heart of God.
On May 1st of 1954, Reverend Moon and 4 other followers officially registered the Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity. Membership quadrupled soon after the establishment of a headquarters in Seoul in 1955. Within a year, members were going out to witness to the local provinces for 40 days at a time. The result was 30 new churches by 1957. And by 1959, Korea boasted 70 churches, with pioneers in Europe, Japan, and America. In April of 1960, Reverend Moon married Hak Ja-han, a woman who had fled North Korea with her mother prior to the Korean War. For the church, it was the beginning of a new era, an age of maturity and of new commitment.
The remarkable aspect of the Unification Church is that it's led by a man and a woman, not just a man. Mrs. Moon, to me, is a woman of great graciousness, kindness, intelligence, and humor. She really embodies the spirit of woman. And I feel that to have a religious movement led by a man and woman indicates that it's man and woman together that transform humanity and transform the world.
From 1960 onward, weddings became increasingly large events within the church. It became the tradition for elders to ask Reverend and Mrs. Moon to suggest marriage partners, as people traditionally ask of their elders in the Orient. To accommodate the situation, Reverend Moon held ceremonies in which several of the couples were married simultaneously. There followed 36 couples in 1961, then 72 couples in 1962, 124 in 1963, 436 in 1968, 777 in 1970, 1,800 in 1975, and 8,000 couples in a joint ceremony between New York and Seoul in 1982.
Well, Reverend Moon believes that the family is the basic unit for God's ideal in the world, and that in bringing people together from different traditions, different backgrounds, different nationalities, different personalities, Reverend Moon can help a couple resolve historical difficulties. It's not uncommon, for example, in our church for people of different races or nationalities to be suggested for matrimony. Now, whether they accept or not is up to the individuals, but certainly Reverend Moon has in mind that all of the historical conflicts can be resolved through a marriage. If, for example, you come from a tradition where blacks and whites have hated each other, If a couple can come together in black and white or Oriental and white marry, certainly that couple must work out all the historical difficulties. If we're going to build a new history, all of the tragedies, terrible things that have happened in the past must be somehow resolved, washed clean, so it can be a pure foundation for that new history. Thus, marriage is largely, for historical purposes, the building of a new future, children that will not have the same prejudices, the same bigotry, the same hatred.
Some people considered our large marriage some sort of strange rite, and it's very difficult for them to digest it. To me, as a participant in the marriage of 2,000 couples, it was a deeply personal experience. I felt that together with men and women from more than 80 nations, I was making a commitment to the future of the children of the world, to make it a place where war can take place no more.
On January 2nd, 1959, Ms. Young-Un Kim left Korea to pioneer the nation that, according to Reverend Moon's teaching, held the central role for the fulfillment of God's will in this age, America.
Coming to this continent, I simply felt awesome. The task was awesome, but I had to start very realistically from the grassroots, all alone. There was no one to consult anything, talk anything, share anything.
Doris Orm, the first person to join Miss Kim when she arrived in Oregon during the winter of 1960, shares her experience.
I would say I joined because God led me in deep way to, in many ways, in fact, all my life, I could say, even from a young child, I had had many experiences with God. Many, I would say, revelations in dream and other ways. I didn't understand that revelation, but later, when I read Divine Principle, I understood very fully what the meaning of that was, and that there would be a great disaster come to the world if man didn't awaken to a deeper realization of God.
Came to the United States in 1961, and I was assigned to a Korean embassy as assistant military attaché, serving 3.5 years as a military diplomat. And Reverend Moon just had only one advice. He said, you love God, you love America, and serve them as brothers and sisters. Do your heart and everything possible. Do not try to ask or get from them. You just go ahead, serve them.
But Dr. Pak soon did have another mission. Reverend Moon asked him to establish a children's singing and dance troupe to travel the globe. The Little Angels of Korea was formed in February of 1963.
I asked him, why children? How can I train the children and take them around the world, 30 kids, around the world, and it's just virtually impossible mission. He told me, the children are the symbol of peace. No one can communicate better message of peace than children. He said, children are the universal languages. So you take the children around the world. So I did. For 20 years, Little Angels of Korea performed more than 2,000 different places around the world in 70 different countries in all 6 continents.
The success of the Little Angels proved to many a skeptic that Reverend Moon's vision of international cultural exchange was not mere whimsical speculation. And in 1968, he furthered his conviction of its importance by founding the International Cultural Foundation. The foundation has sponsored some of the world's most prestigious conferences in sciences and the humanities. Most notable of these, of course, has been the International Conference on the Unity of the Sciences, which has since 1972 annually brought together distinguished scientists, Nobel laureates, and scholars to discuss the need for greater understanding among the sciences.
It is almost inevitable that that kind of conference would have to have been called by a religious organization, because only a religious organization maintains amidst the specialties of the modern world the sense of the unity of all disciplines and the unity of all creation. It gets to the point in some universities where people in one discipline hardly have anything to say to people in the other discipline. But what that kind of specialization forgets is that we really are talking about one world and one cosmos.
Originally intended as an effort to bring together professors from the historically conflicting countries of Japan and Korea, the Professors' World Peace Academy was founded by the Cultural Foundation in 1968. Since that time, it has quickly expanded to its present 50-nation membership, sponsoring a wide range of study groups, seminars, and publications aimed at world peace. In December of 1971, Reverend Moon arrived in the United States, a nation which at that time was being wrung of its convictions and drifting quickly away from many of the things Reverend Moon had come to champion.
To me, America is an obvious choice for Reverend Moon to work in. It is a center of communication. It is a center of people of all races and persuasions. It was inevitable that he had to come here in order to reach out to the world at large. If you can reach America, you can truly reach the entire world.
1975, Reverend Moon gave his first public speech in his native Korea. Despite the event's obvious absence in the Western media, the Yoido Island Rally for Freedom was not only a statement of South Korea's changing attitude toward Reverend Moon, it proved to be the largest event ever held on Korean soil. 1.2 million people attended. Directly after the Yoido Rally, Reverend Moon asked for volunteers from each of three countries, America, Japan, and Germany, to become the first missionaries of unificationism to over 120 nations. Soon after the missionaries left, church members began the International Relief Friendship Foundation with the purpose of helping to alleviate poverty, malnutrition, and disease in many areas of the world. Today, many of the IRFF's projects are manned by church missionaries.
The missionaries actually they start the projects, and they really invest themselves in living with the people, teaching with the people, going through all the steps necessary to make a project successful. They're involved in short-term medical relief projects. We send doctors and nurses overseas to care for the people, and also long-term agricultural development and education and technical training.
With the movement expanding worldwide, the need for a theological center became obvious. In 1975, Reverend Moon founded the Unification Theological Seminary, which because of its interreligious faculty and curriculum, may well be the only truly ecumenical seminary in Christendom. Establishing a seminary is an impressive accomplishment for any religious leader. What is surprising is that very same year, Reverend Moon founded what is referred to as the Juilliard of Korea, the Little Angels School for the Performing Arts. Located on the outskirts of Seoul, the philosophy of the school is based on the founder's conviction that art, as an expression of one's personality, should be done with a spirit of universality. Therefore, the school offers a very thorough curriculum for both general studies and the arts. Today, it stands as one of the most respected educational institutions in the Orient. The facility also houses a complete performing arts center, which besides being the home of the Little Angels dancing troupe, also serves as the home for the recently formed Universal Ballet Company, a professional ballet troupe which has already scheduled tours of Asia, Europe, and America by 1988. When the American Bicentennial Committee forgot to mention God in its declaration of purpose, Reverend Moon sought to set the record straight by holding two rallies for the nation called God Bless America festivals. The first of these took place on a stormy night at Yankee Stadium in New York City on June 1st, 1976.
Jim Fleming and I were in charge of all the decorations, so when the letters went flying out of the infield and when our balloons were flying all over the place when they weren't supposed to be, and the microphones were filled with about a quarter of an inch of water, and the people that we were hiring to do the sound were ready to pack up and go away, actually started to pack up and head home because of so much rain and thunder. So that was an extremely hectic event, Yankee Stadium.
In his providence, God anointed America with oil. He poured out abundant blessing upon this land.
Despite its wet beginning, the success and momentum of the Yankee Stadium event easily paved the way for an even larger festival to be held on September 18th of that year. The God Bless America Festival at the Washington Monument was an American success story. Hard work and faith in a dream brought a result which told America that the new kid on the block was here to stay. A crowd estimated at 300,000 listened to Reverend Moon's address on America's blessing and responsibility at this time in history.
And when he walked out and he saw this big crowd, it was so wonderful to see the smile on his face. And as he began to speak, I could see his face so clearly because I was watching it on TV. It just makes a nice feeling to be able to look at these large crowds and know that our work had been successful.
Aside from his personal experience in communist North Korea, Reverend Moon has watched communism's grim harvest of two-thirds of the world within his lifetime. To him, communism is a direct affront to humanity, not only because it sees man as a materialistic being purely, but because it gives license to treat him as such. For this reason, Reverend Moon has sought to provide an alternative to communism's atheistic worldview. Aside from organizations in the Orient and on campuses around the world, he most recently founded Causa International, an organization which derives its name from the Spanish word for great purpose.
Many Americans tend to view anti-communist movements with a great deal of suspicion. I think part of it harkens back to the McCarthy days. In contrast, Causa has done a very thorough research and study of the contradictions of communism, their unmet goals, their false promises, and in that sense presents, I think, a very studied, very well-researched, very intellectual framework upon which people can learn. We find that if there's one basic premise that pervades all the teachings of communism, it is the premise that there is no God.
Aside from his own treatment by the American media, Reverend Moon felt that the nation was lacking a fair voice in much of what was being reported. In April of 1976, he formed the News World Communications, which became the publisher of two New York dailies, the New York Tribune and Noticias del Mundo. Aside from sponsoring the World Media Association, an organization formed to promote responsibility in the media, News World Communications recently established itself firmly in the nation's capital with the Washington Times.
That we are very grateful here at the Washington Times to the Reverend Moon, to Dr. Park and his associates for having provided us with what I consider to be a magnificent fighting ship in the war of words and the war of ideas, which is the only war going on in the world today. The marvelous thing about the Washington Times is that we are presenting for the first time in this country's recent history alternative views insofar as editorials are concerned, and insofar as reporting is concerned, stories that the other major media outlets are ignoring for a variety of reasons. We have broken countless stories since I've been here that you will not find in other major media outlets to such a degree that they have had to pick them up from us and give us credit for them. When I was in Europe recently, I was delighted to hear the Washington Times quoted every hour on the Voice of America and on the BBC, two worldwide radio networks that happen to reach hundreds of millions of people.
The first thing that has to be understood about Reverend Moon is that he's not a preacher. What he basically is a man who believes that God has inspired him to help transform the world, and his vision of world transformation is rooted in his religious beliefs.
He recognizes, however, that religious traditions have often fallen away from that primary relationship to God. And rather than establishing a model of love within their own communities, there is an emphasis on the externals of religion rather than the internal heart and spirit of love.
For that reason, and for the purpose of bringing greater harmony among all the world's religions, Reverend Moon established the International Religious Foundation. Foremost among its activities has been the annual Conference on God, which brings together many of the world's religious leaders and scholars in an ecumenical dialogue.
As representatives of the world's religions, you are called to bring your churches, mosques, synagogues, shrines, and temples into a cooperative unity for the sake of world peace and human freedom centered on God.
The foundation also sponsors the Youth Seminar on World Religions, an annual pilgrimage by over 150 students who visit the important centers of the world's major religions. Its purpose is to help young people understand the central reality of God in all religions.
But what you see most clearly is this sort of opening up to other people, opening up to people of different races and religions that formerly just hadn't had any reality. They hadn't seen like people that you could really relate to. And over we see that.
In October 1981, the U.S. federal government indicted Reverend Moon on charges of tax evasion. The pretext they chose was a bank account held for the church in his name, a practice done by many religious leaders in this country. The fact that the monies in the account were used for church purposes was ignored. By innuendo, the prosecution implied that because Reverend Moon often decided how the funds were spent, he was the actual owner. The jury turned in a guilty verdict, and the judge sentenced Reverend Moon to 18 months in prison.
Reverend Moon's total tax liability, as I have studied it, and as others have studied it, and I'm not talking about church members here, I happen to be a Roman Catholic, and clearly I studied this problem very seriously before accepting employment at the Washington Times as editor-in-chief. His total tax liability is less than $10,000 for 3 years. No one goes to jail for that in this country.
Because it set a precedent for the restriction of rights of all religious people, the refusal of the Supreme Court to hear the case sparked outrage.
Talked about men like the Reverend Sun Myung Moon. And they said, put him in jail. We don't care if how he's jailed is right or wrong, just get him off the streets. And we contend that the government of the land does not have the right to interfere into the affairs of the church, and we've called for his pardon.
Rallies protesting the government's violation of First Amendment rights took place in Washington and Houston, and ministers across the country pledged to spend 1 week in jail with Reverend Moon as a statement of their solidarity with his plight.
He said, I came to the prison to love America more. When he scrubbed the kitchen floor, he said, I'm cleaning up the American floor. When I distribute the food to the prisoners, I'm feeding God's children. What a joy, without coming to prison. How can I do this kind of chore? When I think of God, there's nothing I cannot do, without being gratitude. This is how he lived.
After spending 13 months in the federal penitentiary in Danbury, Connecticut, Reverend Moon was released on August 20th, 1985. That day in Washington, D.C., over 1,700 religious leaders gathered to welcome him back by holding a banquet in his honor.
You are welcoming me here today, then as you and I know, is not a personal welcome for the individual, Reverend Moon, but is a testament of that will of God, for which I have lived my life, to do the will of God. Is our common and utmost concern. God cannot reside within narrow views. He does not recognize the walls of nationalism or cultural tradition. He is trying to his very hardest today to embrace all of humanity. Throughout my life, I have communicated deeply with God. And through numerous spiritual experiences, I have come to know his heart and his law. I have always testified to this. To me, God is not a vague God residing in the realm of imagination. God is alive, and I relate to him directly in my heart. I experience him in every cell of my body.
Once you taste the love of God, nothing is greater, nothing is more valuable for you. You will hold it for eternity. You have to practice the love of God. You cannot be near to God by just looking at heaven, no, nothing. Only by passionate love to other human beings, God comes so close to you right away. If you say that, yeah, this movement is very hard to follow.
He said, I'm looking forward to the day God smile. He look upon his children, he smile, rejoice, dancing with us. Do you know that's the day of kingdom of heaven, he said.
Transcript of this program or for a free catalog of related publications, please call toll-free 1-800-634-4600. Or you can write Faith and Reality, 4 West 43rd Street, New York, New York, 10036.